the enchanting world of video games, one name shines brighter than most. A name we often associate with fun, adventure, and nostalgia. Nintendo. Its mere mention can make us think of images of iconic characters like Mario and Link, and memories of countless hours spent in pixelated wonderlands. But what if I told you that there's a darker side to Nintendo? Beneath the surface of this beloved gaming giant lies a tale of controversies, challenges, and secrets that may shatter your perception of the company forever. From shady businesses, the Japanese mafia, and bankruptcy, how did Nintendo become a global industry player today? Stay tuned, hit that like button, subscribe, and prepare to be intrigued as we unravel this story. Decades before Mario and other lovable Nintendo video game characters were born, Nintendo would start out as a small playing card business back in 1889 by its founder, Fusajiro Yamauchi. Imagine young Fusajiro at just 13 years old, finding himself working for a cement company in Japan, shouldering the responsibilities of being his family's eldest son. Life was far from easy for young Yamauchi, but he was determined to change his destiny to one day pursue the arts and entertainment. 16 years later, in the city of Kyoto, Fusajiro Yamauchi was finally able to realize his dream. He opened a small shop for his playing card business, naming it Nintendo Koppai. But little did he know that his venture would raise more than a few eyebrows. You see, during those times in Japan, Western influences were frowned upon. The nation was fiercely protective of its traditions and lived in isolation. Playing cards were seen as a symbol of undesirable Western culture. Even worse, gambling was illegal, and cards were often associated with gambling, making the card industry a dangerous place to tread. Perhaps by coincidence or through cunning intuition, Fusajiro was able to seize this opportunity by exploiting a loophole in the laws back then, by selling hanafuda, which translates to flower cards. These nature-themed cards were viewed more as an art rather than an instrument for gambling, so they weren't outlawed back then. However, due to how Fusajiro's cards were designed to have 12 suits of 4 cards each, there was a way to use them for gambling, which didn't go unnoticed in the eyes of the Yakuza, or Japanese gangsters, when they eventually used Fusajiro's products in their underground illegal gambling. This was proven to be a rather profitable business for Fusajiro when most of the Yakuza turned out to be repeat customers, as they needed to use new decks for each game to prevent cheating. And so, business was good for Fusajiro. He was able to hire a small team to help him create the cards, and eventually, he was able to strike a partnership with the Japan Tobacco and Salt Public Corporation for them to be able to sell their now famous hanafuda cards in their stores all across the nation. By 1929, after 40 years of Fusajiro's hard work to expand the company, he was ready to retire, but in order to keep the business in the family, he had his son-in-law, Sekiryu Kaneda, take up the family name and succeed the business as its new president in the same year. In his 20-year tenure as the president, he would go to build bigger systems, aggressively go into more partnerships, and eventually move into a bigger headquarters to conduct business. By the time Sekiryu had to pass the business on, he had no sons to inherit it, which is why, like Fusajiro, he had his son-in-law, Shikanojo Inaba, to take up the family name through marriage and inherit the business. Shikanojo would prove to be unreliable after leaving his wife and 5-year-old son Hiroshi behind in 1932. Hiroshi would prove to be different from his family by taking a different path, law. However, the Yamauchi name would hold on to Hiroshi when eventually, in 1949, Hiroshi received a call that would forever change his life. His grandfather, Sekiryu, was dying, and so he had to pack his life and abandon law to inherit the family business. This inexperienced 21-year-old would plunge into Nintendo's almost 60 years of stability to utter chaos. He would go on to fire family members affiliated with the company, and when he was met with protest from employees, he would go on to retaliate even harder by firing all of them as the president. But before entering the video game industry, Hiroshi would lead Nintendo to all sorts of risky businesses by trying to diversify the market, and products of Nintendo. He first started with selling instant rice packets, which weren't warmly welcomed by the Japanese community. He also started Daiya, a taxi company, which would fail when he grew tired of negotiating terms with the unions. By some stroke of fate, Hiroshi would start a love hotel, seemingly returning to Nintendo's dark ties with the Yakuza. However, this also proved to fail when he allegedly became one of its biggest customers yet. But despite these failures in trying to sell products other than playing cards, Hiroshi was good at one thing: recognizing talent that he doesn't have. By 1966, a breakthrough that he was desperately trying to find in the previous years finally came through a Nintendo assembly line worker and janitor, Gunpei Yokoi. Gunpei's invention, which Hiroshi took notice of, was planned to be mass-produced into 1 million units, called the Ultra Hand, a plastic toy in the form of an extendable hand. Gunpei's idea sold over 1 million units. This was a historical shift in the niche of Nintendo when they started to earnestly focus on toys and games. While Gunpei was ecstatic, easily adapted to his promotion, and spent a lot of time in development and research, his other toys weren't quite as successful as the Ultra Hand. And by 1973, Nintendo was once again pushed back into the brink of bankruptcy by Hiroshi Yamauchi when he decided to bet on random ideas for the second time. And it was once again Gunpei, during one of his train rides, who would take inspiration for the next biggest thing for Nintendo: a pocket-sized game powered by batteries called the Game & Watch. And by 1980, Nintendo could barely keep up as the demand for the portable game soared. Debts were paid and the company was saved once again. It was also around this time that arcade games were starting to get traction. This would not go past Hiroshi when he had Nintendo enter the arcade game market by taking inspiration, or creating a Japanese version of a popular game called Space Invaders, which he reinvented as Radarscope. This was made possible by an already existing team of tech employees who developed the Game & Watch with Gunpei. But just as they were succeeding, Hiroshi's plan to mass-produce this game in the United States didn't work. After all, they wanted a new game, not something similar to Space Invaders. But instead of being shaken by failure and its implications on arcade cabinets gathering dust, Hiroshi would take this opportunity to once again find talent to save them from this crisis. He held a competition in Japan for people to develop arcade games. Around this time, Shigeru Miyamoto, Gunpei's protege, would enter the scene. Shigeru initially wanted to create a Popeye the Sailor Man game, but licensing was expensive and the deal ultimately fell through. This didn't stop Shigeru from taking inspiration from Popeye when he based the characters of his game on it, and eventually developed Donkey Kong, or popularly known as DK. Donkey Kong would become a hit in the US and would later be used as a reference from how one of its main characters, only known as Jumpman, would become Super Mario. While Donkey Kong had its own challenges other than soaring demand, say a lawsuit from Universal Studios, which led to a massive court battle between them and Nintendo's trial lawyer John Kirby, the growing Nintendo only saw it as yet another opportunity. They won the lawsuit, named a character called Kirby in one of their arcade games as a reference to John Kirby, and started to push out more arcade game content in a higher capacity. So who would have thought that this series of successes were about to come crumbling down? By 1982, the video game industry became oversaturated with market players trying to jump in the norm. This led to a lot of technology rapidly becoming cheaper, and video game consoles were getting more widespread. This was a great opportunity for companies like Atari to thrive. And while a lot of smaller-scale companies tried to adapt to this trend, the market saturation where there is a lot of console options, but actually very few good games. In just 3 years, video game sales dropped for over 97% from $3.2 billion to only $100 million in 1985. Another factor that can be attributed to this would be the rise of personal computers in the 1980s. Once they started becoming more affordable, so were the options for gaming and entertainment. With this alternative, the overall consumer confidence in console gaming died down as they shifted to other alternatives. While most small-scale gaming console companies had been forced to shut down due to bankruptcy, and Atari not being spared by this hit on the gaming console industry, Nintendo only saw once again a big opportunity. At this point, Hiroshi's notoriety for gambling both in his personal and professional life has been well established, and he wanted to dominate the gaming console industry not just in Japan, but overseas as well. He first had a new and improved product to be tested in Japan, the Famicom or Family Computer. Famicom quickly became a hit in Japan, but Hiroshi wanted to try something new before its US launch, developing the Nintendo ecosystem. So Hiroshi had to assemble Nintendo's key innovators, such as Shigeru and Gunpei, to change the status quo and develop game changers. During this improvement of the Famicom, Shigeru was able to develop Super Mario and use the Famicom, which would be known as the Nintendo Entertainment System or NES, to augment overall gameplay. No resources were spared in the development of the NES, and it's a companion game. From the gaming experience, audio quality, controllers, and the overall sleek look of the NES, Nintendo went all out for their new innovation. Convincing electronic retail stores in the US to sell their console was another thing. See, they were still reeling from the aftermath of the video game market crash, but once they succeeded, that's when things began to look even brighter for Nintendo. By hooking people to buy the NES on a cheaper price, Nintendo was able to sustain their market by offering new complementary products and new games consistently. By the first year after the NES's launch on the 18th of October 1985 in the US, they were able to sell a whopping 3 million units. This amount would be doubled in the following year and would grow up to 60 million units sold in the coming years. Of course, its success can be highly attributed to its new title, Super Mario, which was launched along with the NES. Thus, Nintendo succeeded not only in dominating the gaming console industry overseas, but also into actually saving it. In fact, this success only prompted for more innovations from the Nintendo group like The Legend of Zelda and eventually, the Game Boy, a handheld console that you can take anywhere. The Game Boy would exceed the NES in sales, and in time, they became household staples in the US. This cemented Nintendo's place in the US as one of the key industry players in the video game industry, just like how Hiroshi gambled. Just when Nintendo thought that its dark days were over, Sega entered the market as the contender for the main gaming console. Sega's point was simple: they're willing to do what Nintendo doesn't, or Nintendon't. On top of that, their console was fairly cheaper than the NES, with better functionality and a wider set of game selections with more violence and action involved. Hence, it was dubbed as the console for the rebellious generation. Nintendo retaliated with the SNES or Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Couple this up with its flagship icon, Mario, and Sega wasn't really left with much options. Ultimately, Nintendo's years of experience and innovation with its products triumphed over Sega. But this didn't end the threats that Nintendo would face. This would be the case in June 1991 when Sony announced a partnership with Nintendo to further innovate gaming experience with CD technology to replace the old game cartridges and improve it. For the most part, it made sense since both companies were playing by their strengths, and people accepted this partnership with anticipation. However, the plan to create a hybrid console experience never pulled through when Nintendo decided to announce that they will be partnering with Sony's rival, Philips, during the Consumer Electronics Show. Sony was beyond furious, and bridges were forever burned. Sony decided to dedicate an entire division to develop their would-be advantage, the PlayStation, even without Nintendo. The PlayStation became a huge hit with better 3D graphics and wider game selections. And by the time that Nintendo was preparing to fight back with another console, Sony released the PlayStation 2 and sold over 155 million units. A year after that, Nintendo released the GameCube, but its sales weren't that impressive compared to Sony's PlayStation. In 2002, another market competitor emerged, the Microsoft Xbox, which would prove to be a good match against the PlayStation. This back and forth over these three huge industry players would go on for years, developing the PlayStation 3 through 5, as well as Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii. The Nintendo Wii was released in 2006 under Satoru Iwata, the fourth president of Nintendo, succeeding Hiroshi Yamauchi, who steered the ship for over 50 years. The Nintendo Wii created a whole new market which was more inclusive and more than gaming. Thus, in that year, Nintendo was able to sell more Wiis than both Xbox and PlayStation combined. Satoru Iwata, who had been with Nintendo for years, was able to secure his foothold as the president of Nintendo. This became the precedent of how Nintendo was always able to survive in the industry, innovation, and its history. This is evident with newer games, like the Nintendo Switch released in 2023 and the Super Mario movie. And while Nintendo's history is, no doubt, a roller coaster, it's also the origins of Nintendo that would serve as the ultimate catalyst for its growth and survival. Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments. If this video has piqued your curiosity, don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more captivating business narratives. Thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, and we'll see you in the next video.